What if one small act of kindness on a flight you never wanted to be on could change everything? He was a single dad just trying to keep custody of his daughter. She was a CEO grieving a father she never got to say goodbye to. They were strangers until one empty seat, one quiet sacrifice, and one moment of unexpected humanity rewrote both their lives. This is a story about second chances, silent strength, and the altitude we reach when we lift someone else. Stay with me, because this story, it may just change the way you see kindness forever. Single dad switched seats with a crying woman. She turned out to be the owner of the Airline. The Denver airport was a storm of rolling luggage gate changes and exhausted travelers clawing at their phones like lifelines. But Lucas Hale wasn't rushing. He couldn't afford to. His 6-year-old daughter Ellie clung to his hand, her pink hoodie pulled over her braided hair, dragging a faded unicorn backpack behind her. Lucas adjusted the duffel bag on his shoulder, watching the flight board flicker. Flight 739 to New York. On time. It had taken every favor coupon and a last-minute miracle to afford these tickets. Well, almost. The real miracle was sitting on the bench beside him, Ellie swinging her legs, humming a song about cupcakes she'd made up herself. He smiled. The court date was tomorrow. One more night in a budget motel, then he would stand before a judge and try to convince the state of New York he was enough. A man in an airline uniform approached. Mr. Hale Lucas stood instantly wary. Yes, the man handed him 2 new boarding passes. You've been upgraded, seats 2A and 2B. Courtesy of an old friend at the desk, I believe. Before Lucas could object, the man nodded politely and disappeared into the crowd. Lucas stared at the tickets, stunned. Business class. Are we in trouble? Ellie whispered. He crouched down, smiling. No, baby. I think someone just gave us a little gift. The moment they stepped into the plane, Lucas felt the difference. Business class was a quiet world of soft lighting, warm towels, and people who looked like they had somewhere to be and someone else to blame for it. He helped Ellie into her wide reclining seat and buckled her in. "Daddy, this seat has a button," she whispered, pushing it. The back reclined halfway. She giggled like it was magic. Lucas chuckled and ruffled her hair. "Don't press them all at once. It might launch us." As the last passengers boarded, Lucas settled in. For once, he didn't feel like an outsider, just a dad flying with his daughter. Maybe this was a sign. And then he saw her. A woman in her early 30s rushed down the aisle. She wore a long black coat over a gray sweater, her hair pinned back in a precise twist, though strands had come loose around her face. She wasn't glamorous, but there was a quiet elegance to her. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her cheeks pale. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched a boarding pass. "I believe I'm in," she started to say to the flight attendant at the front of the cabin. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the attendant interrupted, tapping her tablet. There was a last-minute change. "We had a system reallocation after the check-in software crash this morning. You've been moved to seat 22B. The woman blinked, visibly stunned. "But I booked this seat weeks ago. I paid, I understand. But our system bumped several passengers to balance the load. Your original seat was reassigned during the reshuffle." "I'm terribly sorry." The woman took a breath. Just one. Her lips parted like she wanted to fight back, but something in her posture collapsed. Without a word, she turned and walked back toward Coach, gripping the strap of her shoulder bag so tight her knuckles turned white. Lucas watched her go. She passed their row, and as she did, he heard a sharp intake of breath, the kind someone takes to hold back a scream or a sob. Daddy, Ellie whispered, tugging his sleeve. "That lady's really sad." He looked down at his daughter, and then he stood. "Stay here," he told her softly. He caught up to the woman as she reached her assigned seat 22B beside the bathroom next to an irritable man already sprawling into her space. "Excuse me," Lucas said gently. She turned, startled. He offered his boarding pass. "Take my seat. Business class. It's next to my daughter." Her brows drew in. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged. She asked why you looked sad. The woman stared at him. You don't have to tell me anything, he added, but no one should cry in a seat that smells like hand sanitizer and engine oil. For a moment, she didn't move. Then, very slowly, she took the boarding pass from his hand. I don't know what to say, she murmured. Say thank you by getting some rest. Lucas turned and made his way back to the back of the plane. The seat he'd claimed now was cramped, noisy, and sticky with someone else's spilled drink. He sat anyway. As the plane took off, Lucas leaned his head back and closed his eyes. The seat rumbled beneath him. The air smelled like burnt coffee and cleaning fluid. His knees pressed the seat in front of him. He smiled. From 20 rows ahead he could hear Ellie giggling. And, for now, that was enough. What he didn't see, what he couldn't possibly know, was that the woman he'd just given his seat to was no ordinary traveler. She was Clara Winthrop, CEO and co-founder of Winthrop Air, the very airline they were flying on. And, for the first time in a very long time, someone had done something kind for her, without knowing who she was, or wanting anything in return. And that unlike any seat on this plane was priceless. The hum of the engines was like a lullaby for the weary. Clara Winthrop leaned back into the business-class seat she hadn't paid for, trying not to feel the weight of what she had accepted. The soft leather, the folded blanket on her lap, the quiet clinking of a glass being set down nearby, it should have felt like comfort. Instead, it made her chest ache. She hadn't planned to fly commercial. She hadn't planned to sit among strangers, certainly not back in coach, but definitely not here either, where kindness stared her in the face without asking who she was. The man, Lucas, had looked at her like a person, not a title, not a scandal, not a woman who had just lost a war behind closed doors. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. The handwriting on the outside was unmistakable, her father's. The letter had arrived just 3 days earlier, too late. Her fingers trembled as she held it unopened. She couldn't bring herself to read it. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Clara folded the envelope neatly and slipped it into the book she carried but hadn't opened in months. Across the cabin, Ellie was curled up under the blanket knees, tucked into her chest thumb near her lips, but never quite touching it. The girl looked safe. Peaceful. Clara watched her breathe for a moment and felt the burn of tears press against the back of her throat. She turned away and stared out the window. 20 rows back, Lucas shifted in his cramped seat, adjusting to the vibrating hum near the rear of the plane. His knees were tight against the tray table. The man beside him was snoring into a half-eaten bag of peanuts. Still, Lucas felt lighter. The woman hadn't wanted attention. She hadn't even said thank you the way people usually did with awkward pleasantries or a forced smile, but in her silence there had been honesty. And maybe that's what moved him. Not the tears, not the way she carried herself like someone who hadn't slept in days. It was the dignity in her exhaustion, like she'd spent too long holding up walls that were now cracking. He hadn't done much, just a seat. But Ellie had seen her, and that was enough for him. Clara didn't sleep. Her mind bounced between memories and regrets like turbulence. She remembered the boardroom men in tailored suits with eyes that gleamed when she stumbled. She remembered her father, once her hero, now just a man in a hospital bed hooked to a ventilator breathing borrowed air. He'd founded Winthrop Air with nothing but a dusty crop duster and a second-hand dream. He taught Clara to fly before she could legally drive. She still remembered his voice in the cockpit. Altitude is attitude, baby girl. You fly steady, you rise. But in recent years he had lost that steadiness. Early-onset dementia had robbed him of words, then recognition. Their last conversation was 3 months ago. He thought she was his sister. She hadn't visited since. And now he was gone. She hadn't just lost him. She had lost the chance to fix what was broken. Somewhere near Ohio, the plane hit a mild pocket of turbulence. Clara felt the seatbelt tighten across her lap. Ellie stirred in her seat. Without thinking, Clara reached over and tucked the blanket back over the girl's shoulder. Ellie blinked awake, confused, then smiled. "You're the sad lady," Ellie whispered. Clara blinked. Ellie sat up and tilted her head. My daddy said sad people need soft places to land. Clara managed a shaky breath. Your daddy is very kind. He's my best friend. The girl laid back down content. Her words echoed inside Clara's heart like a whisper from some better world. Soft places to land. It wasn't just a seat. It was space. Grace. Something she hadn't given anyone, least of all herself. Lucas watched the seatbelt sign flicker off. He leaned his head against the window, trying not to think about the courtroom. About tomorrow. About how little he had to offer Ellie beyond loyalty and scraped-together courage. His phone buzzed on airplane mode. A reminder he had set 2 weeks ago, deadline to submit a second employment letter. He hadn't gotten the first one. He closed his eyes and focused on breathing on the soft hum on the miracle of getting his daughter a little comfort in a sky full of uncertainty. Then he felt it. The unmistakable shift, not of the plane, but of something else, a stillness inside him. As the cabin dimmed for the red-eye portion of the flight, Clara sat quietly gazing down at the child beside her. She should move, return to her new seat. But she stayed. She reached into her coat pocket once more and pulled out the letter. This time she opened it. The handwriting was wobbly, barely legible. Clara. If you're reading this, I'm already gone. Don't hold on to the anger, kid. You built something better than I ever could. Even if I couldn't say it at the end, I knew. I knew you had the wings. You always did. Dad. Clara closed her eyes. For the first time in weeks, the tears came freely. But they didn't burn. She folded the letter and placed it back in her coat. Her hand brushed something small, plastic and childlike. She pulled it out, a tiny unicorn eraser. Ellie must have dropped it. She held it tightly in her palm and looked out the window again. In that moment, Clara understood what Lucas had given her wasn't just his seat. He had given her something far rarer. A gentle descent, a moment of being seen, a reminder altitude is attitude. And perhaps for the first time in her long, complicated life, Clara Winthrop wanted to rise for someone else too. She looked down at Ellie and smiled. The sun had barely begun to peak above the horizon when Flight 739 touched down at JFK, its tires screeching softly against the runway like a whispered reminder that reality had arrived. The sterile glow of morning filled the cabin as the plane taxied to the gate and passengers stirred from their red-eye stupor with yawns and neck stretches. Lucas blinked himself awake, rubbing a crick from his neck. He'd barely slept. The seat had offered little in the way of comfort, but it hadn't mattered. Not after seeing Ellie tucked into a real bed of a seat wrapped in a blanket, cheeks rosy with sleep. She deserved that softness, even for a night. The man beside him grunted, reached for his briefcase, and muttered something about connections. Lucas didn't respond. He was too focused on the wave of dread curling through his chest. Court was in 6 hours. He adjusted his hoodie, checked on Ellie through the parted curtain, and reached for the worn canvas duffel bag that carried everything extra clothes, documents, and the last few pieces of a life he was still trying to hold together. The aisle buzzed with movement. As the plane emptied row by row, Lucas spotted an older man a few seats ahead, well-dressed, silver-haired, with the unmistakable air of someone who had flown 1,000 times but never stopped appreciating the magic of it. The man turned, gave Lucas a once-over, and nodded with the kind of respect men offer each other without needing words. Lucas nodded back, surprised. "First time in New York?" the man asked casually. Lucas smiled wryly. "First time arriving with a lawyer waiting to tear me apart." The man raised a brow but chuckled. "Court custody." Lucas said, voice lower. "Ex-wife wants full rights. I lost my job a few months back. Been applying everywhere." The man paused, then extended his hand. "Frank Linwood. I flew for Winthrop for 30 years. Now I just consult and watch the kids make all the mistakes we warned them about." Lucas shook his hand. Lucas Hale. Used to work aircraft systems maintenance out west. Frank looked impressed. "Real work. That counts." Lucas shrugged. "Not in courtrooms." Before Frank could respond, a flight attendant announced final disembarkation. Lucas stood slinging the duffel over his shoulder, glancing once more toward business class. Clara was already gone. Clara stood near baggage claim, watching the carousel spin with the detached gaze of someone who was present in body but nowhere near emotionally grounded. She held her carry-on close, not because it was valuable, but because she needed to hold on to something. A voicemail had greeted her the moment she landed. The hospital. Final arrangements. She hadn't listened to the whole message. Just the beginning was enough. He's gone. She didn't cry. Not this time. Not in public. Not in the chaos of New York, where grief was too common to make space for. But her eyes kept scanning the crowds without realizing what or who she was searching for. Then she saw them. Lucas holding Ellie's hand, weaving through tired passengers and airport noise with the focus of a man walking a tightrope. Ellie skipped her little backpack, bouncing. Lucas carried everything else. Clara found herself frozen. She could have turned away, could have slipped out and into her waiting car, disappearing back into the clean lines of corporate glass towers and boardroom drama. But she didn't. Instead, she stepped forward. "Mr. Hale," she said softly. Lucas stopped, surprised. "Miss." "Clara?" she offered, adjusting the strap of her bag. Ellie beamed. "You sat next to me." Clara smiled. "Yes, I did." Lucas's brow furrowed. "You're still here. I was waiting for my ride. And I suppose I was hoping to see you." Lucas looked skeptical. Why, Clara hesitated. "Because yesterday you offered something most people don't. Kindness without an agenda. And I don't get that often." Lucas shrugged. Didn't seem right letting someone cry in row 22. A long pause. Then Clara added carefully, "I know who you are now, Lucas. I mean what you're facing." Lucas tensed. "You went through my bag." "No," she said quickly. "No. Your daughter talks in her sleep. And that older man, Frank Linwood, he and I go way back. He called me after the flight. Said he met a man who reminded him of the pilots he used to trust with his life." Lucas blinked, caught between suspicion and gratitude. "I'm not offering pity," Clara said, lowering her voice. "But if you need a reference or help with an interview, I have contacts. My father built Winthrop Air from nothing. I'd like to believe he'd want me to help people who still believe in something." Lucas stared at her. Why, he asked. Clara looked at Ellie, then back at him. "Because for a few hours up there you gave me peace. You let me disappear without asking who I was. That meant something." Lucas swallowed emotion, catching in his throat. "I don't want charity," he said. "This isn't charity," she replied. "It's a seat exchange." Then, before he could answer, a car pulled up. A driver stepped out and opened the door. Clara hesitated. "My number's on this card. I don't expect anything. But I meant it. If you ever need a place to land professionally or otherwise." She handed him the card, nodded to Ellie, and climbed into the car. Lucas stood there holding the business card like it weighed 100 pounds. Daddy Ellie whispered, was she a good guy or a sad guy? Lucas smiled faintly. Maybe both. Then he turned toward the exit, the business card tucked into his pocket, still unsure whether he would use it, but knowing deep down, something had changed. For both of them. The line at the baggage carousel was long, loud, and uncooperative, just like Lucas's nerves. He shifted from foot to foot, holding Ellie close as her backpack tugged at his wrist like a balloon caught in a breeze. Her eyes were drooping, and her fingers kept tracing the rim of the hoodie's sleeve like she was trying to disappear inside it. "Daddy, are we late?" she mumbled, resting her cheek against his arm. "No, sweetheart. We've got time," he said, although in his chest the clock was ticking louder than he wanted to admit. The court appointment was in just under 3 hours. That gave them barely enough time to grab their luggage, get to the motel, wash up, change into something that didn't scream "I'm losing," and try to look like a functioning father in front of a judge. Only one problem. Their bags never came. One by one, suitcases thudded onto the belt and were scooped up. The crowd thinned. The carousel slowed, then stopped. Lucas stepped forward and spoke to the agent behind the counter. The young woman wore an apologetic smile that was practiced to the point of performance. "Yes, Mr. Hale. It looks like your luggage was rerouted on a separate cargo transfer due to a last-minute weight distribution protocol. It's in Newark." Lucas blinked. "Newark, that's an hour away." "More like 90 minutes with traffic," the woman added cheerfully. "We can deliver it later today or first thing tomorrow morning." He tried not to laugh. "First thing tomorrow morning won't help much with a custody hearing in 2 hours." The woman's smile faltered. Lucas sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. "Is there anything at all you can do?" She looked at her screen again, then shook her head. "I'm so sorry." Ellie tugged at his arm. "Daddy, are we going to lose Lucas?" Looked down at her, her oversized hoodie, her tired eyes, the anxiety she was too young to name, and something in him cracked. "No baby," he whispered. "We're not going to lose." But he had no idea how he'd make that true. He walked them out of the terminal, his mind spinning. Maybe he could buy something from a thrift store nearby. Maybe he could just go in as is and explain. Maybe a sleek black SUV pulled up along the curb. The back window rolled down. Mr. Hale. He turned, stunned. Clara Winthrop leaned slightly forward from the backseat, sunglasses pushed onto her head, her expression unreadable but unmistakably alert. "I told you," she said, "if you ever needed a place to land." Lucas swallowed. "You've been waiting here." Clara hesitated. "I had a meeting downtown. I canceled it. Don't ask me why." He stared at her, Ellie shifting beside him. She opened the car door. "Get in." The interior smelled like cedar and leather. Ellie immediately curled up into the soft backseat, eyes wide with wonder. Lucas sat upright, uncomfortable in his wrinkled hoodie and jeans. "You didn't have to do this," I know, Clara said, "but I wanted to." He looked at her, searching for motive. "Why?" She looked ahead, voice quiet. "Because I missed my last chance with my father. Because no one gave me a second one. Because I was sitting in the dark on that plane and a stranger handed me his piece without knowing who I was." She turned to him, gaze direct. "Let me return that." Lucas said nothing, but the silence said plenty. The SUV took a sharp turn into a quiet neighborhood near Brooklyn Heights, pulling up in front of a narrow, ivy-covered brownstone. Lucas stepped out warily, glancing up. "Where are we?" "My father's old place," Clara replied. "I keep it mostly for the garden and the bathtub." "The bathtub?" Clara smirked. "You've got 20 minutes to shower. You look like a mechanic after a flight through a wind tunnel." Lucas couldn't help it. He laughed. "There's a suit upstairs, my father's. Might be a little wide in the shoulders. I can't wear your father's clothes to court." Clara's tone softened. "You're not wearing them for him. You're wearing them for your daughter." That stopped him cold. He looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. 20 minutes later, Lucas stepped out of the guest bathroom, hair damp, face clean-shaven, tie slightly crooked, but wearing a deep navy blue suit that looked like it belonged to someone who mattered. Clara stood in the hallway, arms crossed, appraising. "It's too big in the shoulders," she said. "I told you." "But it fits your spine just fine," she added. "You're standing taller." Lucas adjusted the collar. "I don't know what to say." "Say thank you by winning that hearing," Clara replied. As they stepped back into the car, Clara handed Ellie a granola bar and a bottle of water, then turned to Lucas. "Do you have anyone to speak on your behalf?" "A character reference. Someone who can vouch for your parenting." Lucas hesitated. "No, just me." Clara thought for a moment. "Take this," she said, handing him a second business card. "It's my direct line. If the judge will allow a last-minute witness, I'll be there." Lucas blinked. "Why would you do that?" Clara looked at Ellie, then back at him. "Because some people need someone to stand beside them, and others need to know that kindness still counts for something in this world." Lucas felt a wave rise in his chest, humility, gratitude, something like faith. He held her gaze. then tucked the card into his inside pocket. As the SUV pulled away from the curb and headed toward the courthouse, Clara leaned back watching the skyline rise in the distance. In the rearview mirror she saw Ellie rest her head against her father's shoulder, and for the first time in months Clara felt the faintest flutter of hope. Not the corporate kind, the human kind. And it felt like flight. The family court of New York County was a building that seemed designed to squeeze the spirit out of anyone who walked through its glass doors. Stark walls, buzzing fluorescent lights, rows of tired faces clutching paperwork like shields, and that particular hush one born not of reverence, but of worry. Lucas Hale stepped inside Ellie's small hand wrapped tightly in the navy suit, hanging just a bit long in the arms, but doing its job. He felt the stares, the judgment, the unsaid questions. His heart thudded against his ribs like it wanted out. Across the hallway, a door opened and his ex-wife Monica stepped out with her attorney. She was immaculate, power-dressed in pale beige hair, perfectly styled makeup, untouched by the humidity outside. Her eyes flicked over Lucas with a subtle arch of her brow. "Lucas," she said flatly. "Monica," he replied, offering a half nod. Her gaze dropped to Ellie, and for a flicker of a moment there was something soft in it. But then she looked back at him, and it was gone. "You look presentable," she said, as if surprised. Lucas swallowed the bitterness rising in his throat. "Thanks. Let's just try to be civil today," she added. For her," he echoed, squeezing Ellie's hand gently. They were called in moments later. The courtroom wasn't grand, not like in the movies. Just a compact space with wooden benches, a raised platform, and a judge whose eyes already looked weary from the day. Judge Decker, a woman in her late 50s with silvering hair and a no-nonsense expression, sat behind the bench. Case number 814-2025. Custody hearing for minor child Eleanor Hale, the clerk called out. Lucas felt Ellie's fingers tighten around his. Monica's attorney led first. He was polished, smooth-talking, clearly accustomed to winning. He painted a picture of stability. Monica had remarried a successful financial planner, moved into a home in Westchester, and had enrolled Ellie in a private school that offered advanced emotional support and STEM enrichment. He emphasized Lucas's lack of full-time employment, his recent eviction, and the transient nature of his lifestyle. Lucas listened as if the words were fists. Each one chipped away at the life he'd fought to rebuild. His knuckles were white on the table. Then it was his turn. He stood, slowly cleared his throat, and addressed the judge without looking at Monica. "I'm not here to claim I'm perfect," he began, voice steady but low. "I lost my job after a company downsizing. I'm working to rebuild. And yes, I've struggled, but I've never missed a day of Ellie's life. I've never left her without food, shelter, or love." He paused, glanced toward his daughter seated in the gallery. "I've taught her how to read bedtime stories, how to ask questions when she's scared, how to tie her shoes, and how to be kind, especially when it's hard. Because I believe how we treat people matters more than what we have." He met the judge's eyes. "I may not own a house, but I've built her a home in every room we've shared." Silence. Judge Decker leaned forward. "Mr. Hale, have you secured employment since your last filing?" Lucas hesitated. He reached into his jacket and produced a single sheet, the offer letter from Winthrop Air, signed that very morning. Contract consultant, aircraft systems. Term, 6 months, with potential for full-time. The judge read it, then raised an eyebrow. "Just received today. Yes, Your Honor." She turned to Monica's attorney. "Objections." He stood. "With respect, Your Honor, we believe a same-day contract without references or income history does not sufficiently counterbalance the mother's stable living conditions." Judge Decker nodded, slowly thoughtful. Lucas opened his mouth. "I may have a character reference, if the court would allow a short recess." The judge frowned. "Do you have a witness here?" Lucas pulled Clara's card from his jacket pocket. His hand shook slightly. "No, but she's willing to speak if given the chance. Judge Decker glanced at the clerk. We'll recess for 15 minutes. If your witness can appear by phone or in person, we'll allow a statement. Lucas exhaled sharply, stepped outside the courtroom and dialed the number with trembling fingers. Clara answered on the first ring. Lucas. I know this is a lot to ask, but would you be willing to speak to the court? Just a statement. Character? Anything. There was a pause on the line. Then, send me the address. I'm already in Midtown. 15 minutes became 20. Then, 30. Just as Judge Decker looked ready to close the session, the door creaked open. Clara Winthrop entered the courtroom in a simple black blouse and gray slacks, her hair still damp from a quick shower. No makeup, no pretense. The clerk asked her to identify herself. Clara Winthrop, Your Honor, CEO of Winthrop Air. A whisper rippled through the room. Even Monica's attorney's expression twitched. The judge arched a brow. And your relationship to Mr. Hale? I met him yesterday, Clara said calmly, on a plane. He gave me his business class seat when I was having a difficult day. He didn't know who I was. He just saw a person who needed kindness. She turned toward the gallery. And I saw a father who gave up his own comfort for a stranger without expecting anything in return, who told his daughter when she asked about me that sad people need soft places to land. Clara looked back at the judge. I've interviewed hundreds of candidates in my field. I've read resumes with degrees and buzzwords. But character can't be written down. You have to witness it. And in Lucas Hale, I did. She paused. I'd trust him with my company. I'd trust him with far more. The room was silent. Judge Decker leaned back in her chair, folded her hands, and nodded once. I believe I've heard enough for today. A decision will be issued by the end of the week. She banged the gavel. The session was adjourned. Lucas turned to Clara, stunned. You didn't have to say all that. I didn't, she said simply. I meant it. Ellie ran up to them, clutching her father's hand, then turned to Clara. Do you fly all the time? Clara smiled. Almost every day. Can I come with you sometime? Lucas laughed. Ellie. But Clara bent down. Maybe someday, when your daddy lets you. And for the first time in weeks, Lucas didn't feel like he was falling. He felt like he was flying. The rain had come suddenly sweeping through the city in diagonal streaks of silver as Lucas stood beneath the overhang of the courthouse. The suit clung to him slightly. He hadn't expected to leave the courtroom feeling anything close to hope. Yet here it was, stubborn and real, pulsing like a heartbeat he'd forgotten he had. Ellie danced in a shallow puddle, her laughter ricocheting off the concrete. Clara stood a few steps away, phone to her ear, issuing instructions with a calm confidence that belonged to someone used to controlling a storm. Lucas watched her quietly. She'd come when she didn't have to, spoken when no one asked her to. And what she said, what she saw in him, he wasn't sure he believed about himself. But it mattered. It mattered more than he could say. She hung up, tucked the phone into her coat pocket, and met his eyes. You hungry? Lucas blinked. Yeah, kind of. Good, Clara said, because I just pulled a string and you have a 15-minute window to make a first impression. Wait, what? She held up her phone. Head of Technical Operations at Winthrop Air. He owes me at least 2 favors. You want the job right? Lucas hesitated. Now, after everything, Clara smiled. You're wearing the suit. Don't waste the momentum. 35 minutes later, Lucas found himself standing in the lobby of Winthrop Air's New York headquarters, an expansive glass and steel tower with an open atrium and an unmistakable air of quiet precision. Ellie sat beside Clara in the waiting lounge, sipping a hot chocolate the receptionist had graciously offered. She looked up at her dad and gave him a little thumbs up, her face smeared with whipped cream. Lucas turned to Clara. What if I mess this up? Clara tilted her head. Then we try again. But knowing you, you won't. He looked at her, eyes narrowed. Why are you doing this? Her expression softened. because someone once gave me a second chance, and I never got to say thank you." Before he could respond, a man stepped into the lobby. Late 50s, well-built, sharp blazer and a face that looked like it had weathered more than a few engine fires. He extended a hand. "Lucas Hale." "Yes, sir. I'm Dan Rivers. Heard you made quite the impression in a courtroom this morning." Lucas flushed. "I didn't plan for that." "Good," Dan grinned. "Neither does life. Come on back." The interview room wasn't formal, more like a briefing space tucked behind hangar glass. On the wall, a schematic of the Winthrop fleet glowed in soft blue. Lucas sat across from Dan, still drying off tie a little crooked. So Dan began tapping a pen. "You were systems maintenance at Miller Aviation in Colorado. 5 years," Lucas nodded. "Started in mechanical, shifted to diagnostics and flight readiness compliance." Dan raised an eyebrow. "Why'd you leave?" "Didn't have a choice," Lucas said plainly. "They downsized. I was the last hire in my department." Dan grunted. "And what have you been doing since applying?" "Raising my daughter. Fixing what I can. Waiting." Dan looked at him a long moment. "You know how many guys walk in here talking about cutting-edge systems and certifications and can't find a pressure leak without a manual?" "I'm not a genius," Lucas replied, "but I've had to improvise. I'm the guy who makes it work with duct tape and prayer." Dan laughed. "You'll fit right in." He stood. "Contractor role? 6 months. If you prove yourself, we talk full-time. Start next Monday." "Deal." Lucas blinked. "Just like that." Dan held out a hand. "Clara vouches for you, and I trust her judgment more than I trust the FAA." Lucas shook his hand firmly. He didn't feel lucky. He felt seen. When he walked back into the lobby, Ellie ran to him. "Did you get the job?" He bent down, scooped her up, and whispered, "Yeah, I did." She squealed and hugged his neck. Clara stood and approached her face unreadable. Lucas faced her, still holding Ellie. "Why did you really do this?" Clara hesitated. Then in a voice barely above a whisper said, "Because you didn't ask for it. And because, when you looked at me on that plane, you saw a human. Not a headline, not a failure, just someone hurting." Lucas was silent for a moment. Then, "You were never a failure." Clara laughed softly. "You'd be amazed how often I've felt like one. Board votes, shareholder losses, losing my father sometimes. I wonder if I'm just piloting on autopilot through the wreckage." Lucas set Ellie down gently and looked at Clara squarely. "You came back for someone you met for 15 minutes. You stood up in a courtroom you didn't belong in. That's not wreckage, that's flight." Clara didn't answer, but in her eyes something shifted, a kind of lift. They stepped out into the city together. The rain had stopped, the sidewalks shimmered. A taxi splashed by and Ellie skipped between puddles laughing. Lucas turned to Clara. "Can I buy you a cup of coffee? It's not much, but it's mine to offer." She looked at him, a slow smile forming. "I'd like that." They crossed the street, side by side, still strangers in many ways, but no longer circling in separate skies. Above them, a plane climbed into the clearing blue, its contrail stretched like a promise. And for once, neither of them looked away. Lucas stepped through the massive hangar doors, the scent of jet fuel and metal already familiar in his lungs. It had been nearly a week since his interview. Now he stood at the edge of something new, something real. The contractor badge clipped to his shirt still felt surreal. It wasn't permanent. It wasn't glamorous. But it was work. Honest, skilled work. The kind he was good at. The kind that made him feel like himself again. Dan Rivers met him near the inspection area with a clipboard and the weathered face of a man who'd worked through 100 snowstorms and bureaucratic setbacks. "Got a strange one for you this morning," Dan said, leading Lucas toward a parked narrow-body aircraft. Tight turnaround, short layover. Ground team reported a compressor vibration, but diagnostics came back clean. Lucas nodded, already rolling up his sleeves. Could be a sensor glitch. Or a harmonic misread. That's what we're hoping. But we're not sending her back up until you're sure. Lucas set to work climbing the ladder and easing into the maintenance panel with a practiced efficiency. The whine of distant turbines' voices crackling on radios, the occasional slamming of a metal hatch. It was a symphony he knew by heart. He ran the checks, then double-checked. Something didn't feel right. The engine data looked fine, but there was a faint rattling barely audible. Most would miss it. But Lucas had spent 5 years listening to machines like he listened to people. And this one, it was whispering that something was wrong. He climbed back down, walked toward Dan, and handed him a tablet. "This plane doesn't fly." Dan raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Lucas nodded. "It's not the compressor. It's the actuator under the forward mount. It's degrading, won't show up on standard diagnostics yet, but I pulled the logs. Heat stress is climbing. One more flight that arm could shear." Dan stared at him, then cursed under his breath. "This flight's scheduled to carry 90 passengers in 2 hours. We'll have to reroute and ground the bird. I know," Lucas said quietly, "but I'd rather delay 90 people than explain to their families why we didn't listen." Dan gave a slow nod. "You've got instincts, Hale. Keep listening to them." 2 hours later, the decision made headlines not for the grounded plane, but for what it prevented. Another technician later confirmed Lucas's suspicion, a near-catastrophic failure narrowly avoided. It should have been a proud moment, a triumph. But instead, Lucas was summoned to HR. A woman in a gray suit met him in a sterile office, eyes sharp, words rehearsed. "Mr. Hale, it's come to our attention that you intervened on an active aircraft without full certification under Winthrop's New York operations protocol." Lucas stiffened. "I flagged a mechanical issue. I logged it, I reported it, and I stopped a flight that could have." "Yes," she interrupted, "but you're still under provisional contractor status, and according to Clause 14.7 of your agreement, any action taken outside of approved process, especially without a supervising engineer present, places the company at potential legal exposure." Lucas stared at her. "So, what does that mean?" She folded her hands. "You're suspended pending a review, effective immediately." His ears rang. He wanted to laugh. Instead, he nodded, stood, and walked out without a word. Outside, the air felt thinner. He stepped into the terminal walkway, found a quiet bench, and sat. He looked down at his hands, greasy, calloused, capable. The same hands that fixed what others missed. And now they'd cost him everything again. His phone buzzed. A text from Monica. "Court update moved up. Ruling tomorrow. Just FYI." He ran a hand through his hair and stared at the floor. No job, no standing, no chance. That's when Clara called. He didn't answer at first, but she called again. Finally, he picked up. "Lucas." She said, her voice tighter than usual. "They suspended me," he said flatly. A pause. "What I stopped a bad part from going into the sky, and they're suspending me for not waiting for an engineer to approve the order first. That's absurd. It's policy." She went silent, then cold steel in her voice, "Don't go anywhere." 3 hours later, Clara stormed into the executive floor of Winthrop Air. Her presence, normally calm strategic, was crackling with fury. Dan Rivers met her by the elevator. "I heard. I told HR it was nonsense." She didn't slow. "Where is the board?" "They're prepping for the quarterly call." "Not anymore." She burst into the conference room, eyes blazing. 8 board members turned surprised. Several tried to stand. Clara raised a hand. "Sit down." She tossed a copy of the diagnostic report onto the table. "This man, Lucas Hale, saved 90 lives today, and we're punishing him because he didn't wait for permission while doing our job better than our own systems." An older board member cleared his throat. "It's about liability. If something had gone wrong, but it didn't. And do you know why? Because a single father with everything to lose made a decision this company couldn't." Clara circled the table, her voice rising, not in anger, but in conviction. "I built this airline on 2 pillars: efficiency and trust. If we punish our people for acting with conscience, we don't deserve their loyalty. And we sure as hell don't deserve the public's. Silence. Then one of the members, quiet influential, leaned back and murmured, "Reinstate him." Publicly. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the skyline, Lucas sat outside a diner, Ellie coloring quietly beside him. He stared into his coffee, wondering how to explain to her again that life didn't always reward the right thing. Then his phone buzzed. Winthrop, Air. Lucas Hale reinstated. Full-time offer approved. Press release pending. He read it twice. A second later, a new message came through. From Clara. "When this storm clears, you'll see it wasn't the end. It was takeoff." Lucas looked at Ellie. She looked up and smiled. "Daddy, are we flying again?" He reached for her hand. "Yeah, baby, we are." The next morning arrived not with triumph, but with stillness, a kind of breath before the wave quiet. Lucas stood by the small kitchen table in his motel room, a mug of lukewarm coffee cradled in his hands, staring at the envelope in front of him. The paper was soft at the edges, a little worn from being handled too many times. He had written it 3 days ago after the first court session when everything felt like it was slipping beyond repair. The letter wasn't for the judge. It wasn't even for Monica. It was for Ellie. In case he lost, he hadn't intended to show it to anyone. He didn't even know if he'd meant every word when he wrote it. But now, after everything, after the suspension, after Clara's defense, after the reinstatement that came like a second sunrise, it no longer felt like a letter of defeat. It felt like a record of the climb. Ellie stirred on the bed behind him, tangled in the comforter, still in that half-dream world children seem to drift in and out of so effortlessly. She didn't know what the ruling would be today, but she knew her daddy had come back last night not broken, but smiling. Lucas folded the letter again and tucked it into his inside pocket. The courthouse felt different the second time. The first day, it had felt like a battlefront. Now it felt like a test of belief. Monica was already there, standing in the hallway with her husband, arms crossed, jaw tense. Her attorney adjusted his tie, stealing glances at his tablet. Lucas approached quietly. Monica turned toward him, eyes flickering to Ellie. He nodded a greeting. "Morning." She gave a nod back, hesitated, then asked not unkindly, "How's the new job?" Lucas raised an eyebrow. "You heard." "Not from you," she said. He offered a small smile. "It's real. Full-time. Same badge, different wings." Monica looked away for a moment, then back. "I want what's best for her." "You know that, right?" "I do," Lucas said. "And I think we're both getting better at seeing what that actually means." Before she could respond, the clerk called them in. Judge Decker didn't waste time. She glanced at the new documents on her desk, Winthrop's reinstatement letter, a signed statement from Dan Rivers, even a printed copy of the press release that had quietly gone semi-viral overnight. "I've reviewed the new material," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "Mr. Hale, it's clear that your employment situation is not only stabilized but is supported by a major employer that's publicly acknowledged your judgment and character. That weighs heavily in your favor." Lucas nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. To that end, the judge continued, "This court is prepared to award joint custody with shared placement and a flexible visitation schedule based on Mr. Hale's new work hours. Both parties will collaborate on Ellie's education and medical care, and neither will relocate the child more than 50 miles without notice." Lucas exhaled slowly. He hadn't realized he'd been holding his breath. But the judge wasn't finished. "One more thing," she said, her gaze softening. "Mr. Hale, your daughter is young. She may not understand the meaning of what you fought for today. But someday she will. And when that day comes, I hope she finds something, anything that explains who you were when she needed you most." Lucas paused, then reached into his jacket. He pulled out the letter. "May I read something?" he asked. The judge nodded. Lucas unfolded the paper. His voice caught on the first word, but he pushed through. "Dear Ellie, if you're reading this, then something didn't go the way I hoped. Maybe I couldn't prove I was enough. Maybe I lost the chance to hold your hand every morning. But I need you to know I never stopped trying. I fought, not because I wanted to win, but because I wanted you to know you're worth fighting for. I've made mistakes, but loving you has never been one of them. You've been my reason in every dark place, my compass, my laughter when the world went quiet. And no matter what happens, no court, no contract, no title will ever change the truth. I'm your dad, always. Love me. Silence. Even Monica's eyes shimmered. Judge Decker nodded once firmly. That will be entered into the record. After the session, Lucas stepped out into the bright morning sun. Clara stood at the bottom of the steps, arms crossed, her expression unreadable until she saw him. "Joint custody," he said. A smile broke across her face, small, proud, radiant. "I'm proud of you," she said simply. He chuckled. "You barely know me. I know enough." They walked toward the edge of the courthouse together. Ellie ran ahead, spinning in circles like the wind couldn't touch her. Lucas looked at Clara. "That day on the plane you said no one had ever offered you peace without asking who you were." "I remember." And now Clara glanced at him, eyes full. Now she said softly, "I think I finally learned how to land." They watched Ellie twirl in the sunlight, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then Lucas reached into his coat again and handed Clara the letter. "I wrote it in case I lost. Thought about burning it. But maybe she should hear it someday. From someone who's lived through both the crash and the climb." Clara accepted it with both hands, holding it as if it were made of glass. "She will," she whispered. "And when she does, she'll know exactly the kind of man her father is." And somewhere high above them, a plane sliced through the blue wing's steady course, true. Just like Lucas. The terminal lights cast a golden hue across the gleaming floors of JFK as Lucas walked toward Gate 34. His contractor badge now replaced with a permanent one that bore his full name and the Winthrop Air logo. It had been 3 weeks since the custody ruling and his reinstatement. 3 weeks since life once spiraling had leveled into something like flight. Ellie had spent the weekend with Monica by choice. They were learning how to share her without tearing her apart. Monica had even texted Lucas a photo of Ellie eating pancakes, cheeks full, grinning wildly. It wasn't perfection. It was progress. Lucas adjusted the collar of his crisp navy blue jacket and entered the operations wing where Clara was waiting beside a conference room window. She was staring out at the tarmac, arms across her reflection lined with thought. "Boss lady," he said gently, his voice teasing but warm. She turned. There was something in her face today, something different. Not stress, not fatigue. Something harder to place. "I just got out of the board meeting," she said. They reviewed the full timeline of the grounded flight. Lucas stiffened. "Am I in trouble again?" "No," she replied quickly. Quite the opposite. She stepped toward him and handed over a document. Lucas scanned it, an internal commendation form signed by 4 executives and Dan Rivers himself. In the margin was a handwritten note. Some people save planes. Others save the company. Clara watched him read, then spoke softly. "The board is asking me to return as full-time CEO effective immediately. They're reinstating my voting shares." Lucas blinked. "Clara, that's what you've been fighting for?" She nodded, but there was no joy in her eyes. Only wait. "And yet I'm standing here wondering if it's still what I want," she said. He tilted his head. "Why wouldn't it be?" She hesitated. "Because for the first time in years, I've done things that had nothing to do with shareholders' profit margins or press releases. I defended a man I barely knew because it felt right. I shared a moment with his daughter on a red-eye flight that reminded me what grace looks like when it's not wrapped in polish." She looked down, and I liked that version of me better. Lucas was quiet for a long moment. Then, gently, "You don't have to stop being her." Her eyes lifted to his. "I think you forgot," he added, "that the version of you who fights for what's right is the real one. The boardroom didn't build you. You brought integrity into it. Don't let them take it back now that you've remembered what it feels like." Clara stared at him, her breath catching slightly. "Besides," he added with a crooked smile, "I'm kind of counting on having a boss who still believes in giving the right people a second chance." Her laugh was soft but real. Later that evening, Clara sent out an internal memo, not to the public, not to the press, but to her team. Effective today, Winthrop Air will be launching a new internal initiative, the HAIL Protocol, a system that empowers on-site maintenance staff to flag safety risks even without senior authorization, because sometimes instinct outruns policy, and because trust is earned not by position but by principle. Clara Winthrop, CEO. The following Friday, Clara invited Lucas to accompany her to a company-sponsored community outreach event, an aviation education day at a local youth center in Queens. Dozens of children arrived with wide eyes and open notebooks ready to hear from real pilots and engineers. Lucas stepped in front of a group of 10-year-olds, knelt beside a model engine, and began explaining how airflow worked. Clara watched from the corner of the room, arms folded, smiling. But what struck her wasn't the technical talk. It was the way Ellie, who had come along coloring on a corner table, looked at her father. Like he could lift an entire plane with one arm. Like he was the plane. Later, when the event wrapped, Clara offered to drive them home. In the car, as Ellie dozed in the back seat, Lucas turned toward her. "Why did you really name it the HAIL Protocol?" Clara didn't look at him right away. Then, quietly, "Because people need to be reminded that good men don't need spotlights. They need systems that trust their integrity. You didn't just prevent a failure that day, you revealed one. In us." Lucas was silent. The weight of those words settled deep. After a pause, Clara asked almost nervously, "Do you ever think about that flight, that moment?" "All the time," he said. "What do you think it meant?" He glanced at her. "I think it meant I was finally seen. And I think you were too." Their eyes met. For a long, quiet beat, nothing moved except the steady glow of streetlights through the window. Then Ellie stirred in the back seat. Daddy Lucas reached back, touched her hand gently. "Yeah, baby. Are you and Miss Clara flying again soon?" He smiled at her through the rearview mirror. "I don't know, kiddo. Maybe we never landed." Clara looked at him, something fragile and beautiful blooming just behind her eyes. Maybe they hadn't. Maybe they'd just been circling each at a different altitude, waiting for the right place and the right person to land beside. And now the runway was clear. Rain traced long silver lines down the courthouse windows as Lucas sat once more in the corridor outside Judge Decker's courtroom. But this time he wasn't gripping his knees in silent panic. He wasn't sweating through an ill-fitting suit or staring at the floor as if it might swallow him whole. He was calm, because now he had something that no legal ruling could give or take away: stability, purpose, and a quiet kind of pride. Ellie sat beside him, swinging her legs. She was wearing a navy dress with tiny airplanes embroidered along the hem. She'd picked it herself. "I want to look like I fly," she had declared that morning. Lucas smoothed the collar of his shirt, glanced down at the folder on his lap. Inside were the final documents: job confirmation, salary, summary housing lease agreement, the foundation of a life rebuilt brick by brick. The clerk opened the door. "Mr. Hale, Ms. Brennan, the judge is ready." Lucas looked up to find Monica standing across the hallway wearing a tailored gray dress and a softer expression than he'd seen in a long time. Her husband remained near the elevator, respectfully distant. Monica stepped closer. "You look good," "Thanks," Lucas said. "So do you." She glanced at Ellie, then back at him. "I've been thinking, maybe we don't need to fight anymore." Lucas studied her face, still proud, still guarded, but something inside had shifted. "Agreed," he said gently. "Let's stop treating each other like enemies." She nodded. They walked in together. Judge Decker looked up as the three entered. "Back again," she said dryly, though there was a glimmer of warmth behind her glasses. "Let's make this the last one, shall we?" "Yes, Your Honor." Monica and Lucas answered in unison. The judge reviewed the files, silently flipping through pages with a precision honed by decades of decisions. Then she looked up. "Before I rule, I want to ask one question. Not to the attorneys, but to the parents." She set down her pen. "What do you want Ellie to remember about this moment 10 years from now?" Lucas felt his heart skip. He turned to Monica. She answered first. "I want her to remember that her parents put her first, even when it hurt, that we chose peace over pride." Judge Decker nodded, then turned to Lucas. He cleared his throat. "I want her to remember that she was always enough, that no matter what room we were in, she was never the one on trial." The judge let the silence hang. Then she smiled, just faintly. "This court finds both parties capable, loving, and deeply committed. Therefore, custody will remain joint with placement divided on a flexible cooperative schedule. This agreement is not just legal, it is a moral pact. Break it, and you don't just break trust with each other, you break it with Ellie." Lucas swallowed. "Yes, ma'am." The gavel came down, a sound not of judgment but of closure. Afterward, Lucas stepped out into the fresh air, Ellie perched on his shoulders like a pilot in the cockpit. Monica stood with her husband, speaking quietly but looking more relaxed than she had in years. Clara waited on the courthouse steps, a coffee in one hand, a raincoat draped over the other arm. "You came," Lucas said, lowering Ellie to the ground. "I wanted to hear the landing," she said. "I figured I owed it to the flight." Lucas laughed. "We made it. I know." She handed him the coffee. "You even stuck the landing." They stood together quiet for a moment, the air rich with possibility. Ellie tugged Clara's sleeve. "Miss Clara, are you coming to lunch with us?" Clara looked down at her. "Lunch?" Lucas smiled. "She thinks pancakes are the proper way to celebrate legal victories." "Who am I to argue with aviation law?" Clara replied. They walked toward the car. Lucas turned to her. "You know this whole thing started because you lost a seat." "No," she said. "This whole thing started because you gave yours." They reached the car, but Clara hesitated before getting in. "There's something else," she said, her voice lower. "The board offered me a significant expansion package, more powerful control over all corporate decisions. The kind of authority I always thought I wanted." Lucas raised an eyebrow. But I said no." His eyes widened. "Seriously?" Clara nodded. "I don't want to fly solo anymore. I want to build something, not just run something." She looked at him carefully. "I've been offered a leadership seat at the company's new community aviation program, hands-on training for single parents, veterans, displaced workers. It's not a press headline, but it's real." Lucas stared at her, pride swelling in his chest. "You're becoming the kind of pilot your father always knew you were." She smiled. "I think I finally understand what he meant when he said, 'Altitude is attitude.'" They got into the car, Ellie in the back, humming, Clara beside him. Lucas drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near hers. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fireworks or orchestras. It was better. It was quiet, steady flight. And for the first time in his life, Lucas didn't feel like he was chasing the horizon. He was on course. And seated beside him was someone who understood flight isn't just about takeoff. It's about staying in the air, together. The air buzzed with the sounds of children laughing, hammers tapping, and a distant guitar strumming near the steps of the freshly painted brick building. It had once been an abandoned field office near LaGuardia Airport, forgotten, cracked, overgrown. Today, it had become something else entirely. Lucas stood beneath the newly mounted sign that read, "The Harris Winthrop Center for Aviation and Community." Below it, in smaller brushed steel lettering, "For those who kept showing up, even when the skies were against them." He wore jeans and a button-down rolled at the sleeves, clipboard in hand, surrounded by volunteers installing benches, wiring classrooms, and hauling crates of tools and safety vests. But his eyes were on the front entrance where a crowd had begun to gather for the opening ceremony. Ellie darted between paint buckets, passing out bottled water like a miniature flight attendant wearing a t-shirt 2 sizes too big that read, "Future Pilot." "Daddy, you forgot the safety cones again," she yelled, grinning. Lucas waved her off, delegating. "That's what bosses do." She rolled her eyes with the exaggerated flair only an 8-year-old could master, then ran off again. Behind him, Clara stepped into view, clipboard under her arm, aviator sunglasses perched on her head. She wore a navy jumpsuit and sneakers dust on her knees and a smile on her face. "We're 5 minutes behind schedule," she said. "We're still ahead of miracles," Lucas replied. She tilted her head. Was that poetic or sarcastic? A little of both. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the small crowd gather near the stage. Former mechanics, single parents, flight school dropouts, veterans, all people who had somehow been told in one way or another that they weren't enough. Today, they had a place to restart. Lucas turned to Clara. "You ever think about that flight, that moment in seat 22B all the time?" she said softly. "And now, look at you. CEO, community visionary, children's mural supervisor?" Clara laughed. "And you, full-time tech lead, legal co-parent, pancake whisperer." He smiled, but then his voice dropped genuine. "You didn't just change my life, Clara. You reminded me I was still worth choosing." She looked up at him, eyes soft. "I didn't give you anything you hadn't already earned," she said. "I just made space for you to see it." He paused. "And what about you? Have you made space for yourself yet?" There was a pause, then a flicker of emotion in her expression, the kind that said the answer was still being written, but it was finally being written in ink. Clara nodded once. "I'm learning, but I like the altitude I'm flying at now." The event began. Speeches were given short, honest, full of humanity. A young mother spoke of how she'd been rejected from flight school after her second child, and how now she was weeks away from certification. A retired mechanic shared how he hadn't worn his name tag in years until someone at the center said, "We still need your hands." And then Lucas was called to the podium. He stepped up, heart thudding in the chest that once feared every room he entered. "Most of you know me as the guy who broke the coffee machine twice during setup," he began to gentle laughter. "But a while ago, I was just a guy who gave up his airplane seat to a stranger who looked like she needed it more." His eyes found Clara in the crowd. That small act. "It changed everything. Not because it earned me a job or brought me here today, but because it taught me that kindness doesn't vanish. It multiplies." He held up a small toy plane, Ellie's favorite one from when she was little. "This place we've built, it's not about aviation. Not really. It's about giving people a safe place to take off again." He handed the plane to Ellie, who stood nearby. "And when we lift each other, we all fly higher." Applause followed, not loud, but deep, from the heart. That evening, after the sun dipped low and the center emptied out, Lucas sat on the steps of the building, sipping from a paper cup. Ellie had fallen asleep inside, curled on a beanbag, a flight manual open on her chest. Clara sat beside him, arms folded, her shoulders relaxed in the way they only were when she was truly herself. The silence was companionable. Funny, Lucas said, "I used to think my whole life was stuck in standby mode. Now, I feel like I've finally left the ground." Clara turned to him. "You didn't just leave the ground, Lucas. You built the runway for others." He looked at her then, a different look, one not of wonder or gratitude or uncertainty, but of clarity. Deep, grounded knowing. "I'm not asking for anything you're not ready to give," he said gently. "But if you ever think about flying tandem." She smiled, slow and warm. "Already packing my bags." They both laughed quietly. Then Clara leaned her head on his shoulder, and the world settled into that still sacred place where nothing needed to be said, where two people, once strangers in the sky, had found their way to the same ground and maybe the same future. Above them, a plane soared across the darkening sky, its lights blinking steadily against the dusk. And for the first time in a long time, Lucas didn't look up with longing. He looked forward with hope, because the kindness he had once given freely in silence had come back not as a reward, but as a life, and that life was flying higher than ever. Sometimes we don't need a grand rescue. We just need someone to give us a little room, to take off again. Lucas gave up his seat, but gained his purpose. Clara lost her direction, but found a way to lead with heart. And Ellie. She got the most precious gift of all, a father who never stopped showing up. Because in the end, kindness isn't about what you get back. It's about what you pass forward. Where are you watching from today? And have you ever experienced a moment of kindness that changed your life? If this story touched, you don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more real human stories every week. Thank you for spending this time with us. Until next time, stay kind, stay strong, and remember, every heart has wings.